Hello and welcome to another English 101 video. So, by now you should have developed a thesis statement that will drive your op-ed, right? We had a discussion about the pros and cons of solitary confinement. I've encouraged you to read a lot of different materials about this. And so I'm hoping that you are starting to develop your own opinion about solitary, about what needs to be done, about what you think it should look like, and about whether you see it more as a useful tool or more as something that needs to be reduced. The thesis statement is where you make your stance on solitary clear. Okay, so in addition to the discussion board, be sure to look at my feedback on that, which you should be able to see soon, because I'll give you direct feedback on your thesis statement, whether it is specific enough and whether it has some clear opinion. Because once in a while, I do get students that will offer a factual statement where they'll say solitary confinement is where you keep one prisoner away from others in a small room. There's no opinion there, right? That won't work as a thesis statement for your op-ed. So be sure to watch for my feedback on that. Here's the thing, though. The thesis statement is one small part of the op-ed. It makes clear where the thing is going, but that's not what convinces the readers. What convinces the readers is the points of support. This is what you use to prove to them, to show them why you hold the position that you do, and to encourage them to come over to your way of thinking about this. So, points of support are so important, we're actually going to have two different discussions about them. This week, we're going to talk just kind of about points of support in general. And next week, we're going to talk about how to use information from a source in your point of support, right? Because you are required to do that in the op-ed. You're supposed to use either writer or Rowe or another source of your choosing. But of course, you are also allowed to use other places to get points of support for your op-ed. You can use your own reasoning, or if you or someone you know has had experience with either side of the criminal justice system, you can use personal experience. Why is this allowed in an op-ed? Because that's how op-eds work, right? Their audience is a popular audience, not an academic audience like your rhetorical analysis paper. When you're writing for a popular audience, you can use personal examples. You can use I statements. And indeed, Rowe does, I believe, or he uses we, right? There are many op-eds you can look at where the writers will use personal experience because oftentimes op-eds are the op-eds that are published come from people who have some firsthand knowledge of the topic, right? So you don't have to use personal experience in your op-ed, but you are welcome to use your own reasoning for one of the points of support. Again, so that's the plan. Right now we're going to talk about points of support in general, and then next week we're going to talk about how to use a source specifically. Let's look at some examples, right? This feels very abstract. What should we use for examples? This is the beauty of asking you to write something real instead of some made up document I created. I'm asking you to write a real thing. An op-ed is a real genre, right? You could potentially submit your op-ed to a real newspaper, right? So look, if we're going to talk about how points of support work in an op-ed, let's look at a real op-ed, okay? Let's look at the op-eds that you had to read, right? Here's the one from Don Rowe. This is fascinating to me because Don Rowe is not an English professor, right? So he's not using his points of support this way because anyone told him to, right? Or because he has a PhD in rhetoric, right? He is using the points of support this way because they're convincing, right? And so I think he's a good guy to use. And we'll talk about writer as well, right? Okay. Now, Rowe's approach here is kind of non-traditional because he doesn't give you the thesis right away, right? He gives you this really disturbing example of, he gives you actually one of his reasons why we need solitary right in the first paragraph to hook you. And then he gives you the thesis much further down here, right? This is sort of his thesis, right? Now, let's look at one of his points of support, though, because that's what we're talking about today. Here's one of them here. Contrary to popular misconception, the SHU, right, the Special Housing Unit, also known as solitary, bears no resemblance to the Hollywood stereotypes that perpetuate a myth of inhumane treatment. I'm going to ask you a really silly question. Why can't he just stop there? Why isn't it enough to say that, to say just that? He has credibility, right? He's worked there as a guard, obviously. He's the head of the guard union. So why isn't it enough for him to just say that? You know why. Because readers want more. Readers are skeptical. Smart people like you are skeptical. And when you read this right here, this is a claim. A lot of times the topic sentence for a paragraph is a claim, right? It lays out something that a belief, right, that that you use the rest of the paragraph to prove, right? And so when Rowe says this, there are many readers that will say, I don't believe you, prove it, right? And so indeed, the rest of the paragraph is spent on proving that point. Now the layout here is a little funky. I would argue that this is still really part of that same paragraph, right? Because he's letting you know all of the great things that inmates are allowed to do even when they're in solitary. It is proving his point, what? That it is not inhumane, right? And if he can prove to you that it is not inhumane, excuse me, this relates back to his thesis, right? That this is a critical tool that we should not be tampering with. You see how that works? So this is one of his points of support right here. Okay. Let's find one more for him and then we'll move on to Ryder. Okay, let's look at one more point of support from Rowe. Here he says it, being solitary, is a particularly important strategy in medium security facilities. Again, this is a claim, right? You could see some readers saying, no, we don't need it there. We only need it for the worst people, right? In maximum security. And he says, let me show you why. Let me use the rest of this paragraph to show you why. In this setting, a violent disruption not only threatens safety, but it prevents some of the people who are behaving properly from being able to get rehabilitated, right? Think about it. If I'm someone who committed a nonviolent crime, right? Maybe I passed a bunch of bad checks or something terrible like that, and I go to prison, and you want me to get rehabilitated so I can get out and do something with my life, right? Okay, I can't go to take a GED class and get rehabilitated if I'm worried that another person in the class is going to stab me, right? This is Rowe's point, basically, that solitary restores order to the dorm environment. Right. And so do you see how, again, here's the claim, and then the rest of the paragraph is used to prove the claim. These paragraphs are a little shorter than I would like yours to be, but the concept is the same. And again, this ties back to the thesis, right? Why does he support solitary? Because as we said above, it's not as bad as Hollywood makes it out to be. And here he says it's because we need it to ensure that the people who are following the rules can get rehabilitated. Okay, let's talk about the Ryder article. So Ryder's approach is a little non-traditional in that he doesn't really clearly state his thesis until the end of the op-ed. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a different approach to the reasoning, which is fine. You know, you're going to opt for the more traditional approach. I want you to deploy your thesis very early on, preferably in the first paragraph or maybe the second paragraph, to make sure the reader knows where things are headed, because that is indeed what most op-ed writers do. But enough about that, because we're here to talk about the points of support. So let's talk about some of Ryder's points of support. Here's one of them, right? Here is what's called a specific example. He's not looking at big data about solitary here. He's looking at a specific example. So that means it's less generalizable because it's only about one person. However, it has an ingrained pathos appeal, because when you tell the story of one person, it can really have an impact on the reader, right? And so he tells you about some of the things that have happened to Mr. Browder, which it appears that solitary played a role in, right? And so Of course, this sentence is not going to do enough work in that regard, right? So for Ryder, this point of support has to be some explanation of what happened to Browder. What does this paragraph prove? Well, it's supposed to give the reader pause and think, whoa, this is concerning. I'm not sure I want to support something that might potentially cause serious enough mental illness to lead to suicide, right? Here's another specific example here about violence that was directed towards actually the head of the DOC in Colorado that was to some degree attributed to solitary by this person here in the quote, right? So again, this is suggesting that solitary does not really do the rehabilitation work that we might hope. So again, very similar to what we talked about in Roe. And when we looked at the Roe article, right, like to prove these things, for these authors to prove why they do or don't support solitary, to convince you, it requires some room, right, some space. And so, of course, Ryder here has a decent topic sentence, right? He lets you know, hey, this leads to problems for people. And the reader says, well, what problems do you mean? And so then he goes ahead and delves into that. Let me show you one more example from Ryder before we wind up here. Okay. Look at this one. So here his point is that solitary is just too costly, right? And again, similar to what we talked about in Roe, when you see this, you might think, prove it to me, right? As well you should. As a reader, you should always be skeptical of what you read online. I don't care if it's the LA Times or the New York Times or CNN. You should always be skeptical of what you read and do the work to determine whether this is something that is credible, right? Again, so you say, well, prove it. And then he has this data from California officials. The only reason I don't really like this paragraph is here he kind of shifts over to mental health issues, right? Which is more related to that Browder example from down below. I really think he probably should have spent a bit more time here talking about cost, and it would have been more convincing, right? Like he could talk about what could we do with all of this money that we might save if we reduce the use of solitary. I'm not sure if it's in one of the sample papers, but I did receive a paper from a student some years ago where they made a pretty convincing point about why are we paying all this money, for an approach to confinement that potentially makes these people have more problems when we could be using that money for other things, right? Again, there are lots of different reasons for you to consider here, both reasons in favor of solitary and reasons that oppose it, right? That was demonstrated in the discussion board activity, right? So you have a lot of different things to choose from. And these articles too, hopefully this video that I made here helps you think about not just how points of support work and how you might structure your own body paragraphs, but also helps you think about kind of some other points of support you might use, you might borrow from these articles, right? Because you are expected to do that. And we will talk actually next week. We're going to have a video about how to use a point of support from a source, because that's a little trickier, right? Because if you're going to use a fact from a source, then you're going to need in-text citation. You're going to need a quote, and of course the quote can't do all the work for you. That's a bit more complicated, and so we'll talk more about that next week. This is just sort of an introduction to how points of support work in general, so that you can get some of your own ideas on paper as we're running up to this peer review for why you do or don't support solitary. That's all I've got. And I hope you have a great day. As always, reach out to me if you have questions about the content in this video or anything else that you're working on. Take care now.